David?
The Lord says, hold on to my word. When the enemy attacks, if you speak my word, the enemy will flee, and the victory is yours.
It's good. It's good. How are we all? Good. If you don't know, my name is Robert. I'm one of the pastors here, and if this is your first time, we want to say welcome. If you are watching us online, if this is your first time, if this is your whatever time, we want to say welcome. No matter if this is your first time, 8th time, perhaps last time. We want to say welcome, and we are convinced of this. We are blessed because you've come. We are blessed because you've joined in and tuned into us this morning. And so we look forward to engaging with you, connecting with you after this. If you're here in person, we want to have a coffee with you. If you drink coffee, if you don't, we'll pray for you and we'll get that sorted and fixed. But hey, we are thrilled that you are here with us this morning. And how many of you are enjoying the cooler weather today? Yes. Chris? Better than yesterday. Yeah, absolutely enjoying it. So I want to open and I want to start with a question. And the question is this: not how. Have you ever been so hurt by someone that even the thought of forgiving them felt impossible? You've been so hurt by something that someone did, something that someone said, not necessarily deliberately, but the idea of forgiving them felt next to impossible. Like someone at work, they said something, they stabbed you in the back. You got that family member that's a constant problem. Like that friend that accidentally did something they weren't meaning to, but the pain that accidental action, whatever it was so impactful and so deep piercing. Like the idea of forgiving them seems nearly impossible. I remember when Sage and I were pretty well first married. Nothing Sage did. I'm not going there. So when Sage and I were first married, like the first 12 months, it was something like that. We had two friends that we were friends with, two different families, and we thought that we would do a Thanksgiving lunch or a dinner. I can't remember what it was. I'm pretty sure it was a lunch. And I get that we're not American. We don't necessarily do Thanksgiving in Australia, but we like the idea of doing a Thanksgiving. As far as, especially it's around harvest time, and it's like giving thanks for what God is providing and giving. That was the idea behind it. And so we invited these friends to come, and we were gonna do a lunch, and there was two different families, and they both had excuses, two different excuses as to why they couldn't be there, which is fine. Like it is what it is, and that was that. And I remember the day of Thanksgiving, I just happened to be driving past one of their houses, and I noticed the cars there. And I realized that these friends that we'd invited to do a Thanksgiving dinner and decided to do a Thanksgiving lunch had decided to do something without us, with just them. And I remember as I drove past, like holding onto the steering wheel tighter than what I did, not because I was worried about crashing, but because I was so angry and hurt. And I remember thinking and wrestling with, like, why have we been, like, why have they not included us? Why have they pushed us aside? What have we done? What have I done that's so appalling, so to speak, that they don't want us to engage with? And I felt so attacked and hurt and broken, so to speak. And I remember driving back home, and I shared it with Sage, and I think I was more hurt than what she was, and you can't even remember this story. That's typical of Sage. Everything she's good with. Me, on the other hand, not so. But so, like, I remember feeling absolutely so gutted and hurt and wounded by it. And as the days and the weeks, and I'm not, like, it's that long ago, I cannot remember how long I held on to this, and it's kind of beside the point. It's what I do remember. I remember the grudge that I was feeling, and the deep pain and the anger that I had towards them, and perhaps maybe it's too strong a wording, but I'm going to use it anyways. The hatred that I had towards them at that time, it wasn't hurting them. It was only hurting me. I was so angry and so what have you at them, but all that directed at them, it wasn't hurting them, it was only hurting me. And you would have heard it, probably something similar, the statement of, it was like I drank the poison expecting them to die. Like me holding on to the bitterness, the hurt, the grudge, the anger, towards them, it was like me holding on to that was me drinking poison, assuming that it's going to affect them and not touch me, but it was eating me up and destroying me and not them. And imagine that like my story is not unique. You've got your own stories. That you've had something similar to that, and perhaps where you gripped onto the steering wheel and you held it tighter. Or there's that text message that came through and it made you want to throw your phone and you squeezed it. Or whatever it was, that moment where there was that just incredible hurt that entered your heart and you started to develop and hold on to a grudge. And perhaps what you realized at some point is that me holding on to this isn't hurting them like I want it to. Because if I'm honest, I wanted my hurt to hurt them. I wanted them to feel my pain. But the issue is, the more I held on to that, the more I was hurting and the less, well, it didn't affect them at all. Which is the thing that I want to talk about and drill down on this morning, is this idea that forgiveness isn't about letting them off the hook. It's about setting yourself free. Forgiveness isn't about letting people off the hook. Forgiveness isn't about letting people off the hook. It's about setting yourself free. Forgiveness doesn't mean that you don't have that deliberate conversation where you don't sit down with them and say, hey, do you realize how much you wounded me, how much you hurt me? It doesn't mean that you don't have that. It doesn't mean that if someone did something to you that was illegal that you don't seek prosecution, so to speak. It doesn't mean that. It's about setting yourself free or setting your heart free. And to help with that, I want to take us through a story this morning. A story from Matthew's account of the life and ministry of Jesus. And Matthew records some of the happenings, some of the conversations that Jesus has with people. And he records this conversation that Jesus has with one of the disciples, Peter. And it's probably a conversation that he's having with everyone. But Peter's the one that asks and wrestles with the question that's potentially and most likely a question that we've all wrestled with or thought about, whether we've literally asked it or we just wondered it in our own hearts and our own minds. And that's a question of like, when do I just stop forgiving people? Like when that family member, that co-worker, that friend, that individual keeps doing the similar thing over and over again, when am I justified enough to just not forgive them anymore? And this is the question that Peter is asking Jesus, and it says this in Matthew 18 from verse 21. Peter came to Jesus. Peter came to him and asked, Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? Like 7 times. Is that a justifiable amount that I have tried my best to forgive them? That I have done my all to put to try and reconcile the relationship? Like, is 7 times enough? They've hurt me once, I forgave them. Twice, 3 times, 5 times, 7 times. Like, have I done? That's surely, Jesus, surely that's enough. Like, I imagine some of you have done that. So I know this is the conversation that I've had in my own head between me and God. Like, is it okay for me to give them the figurative bird and just walk away? Is it okay for me to do that? And so Peter's asking the question that we're probably all bouncing around in our heads at time to time. And maybe you've walked in this morning and that's the question that you're wrestling with. I've got this person in my life and I don't know what to do with it because they hurt me. When can I stop forgiving them? So Jesus responds to this question that Peter's asking, that the rest of the disciples are probably asking, and the question that we all have asked at times. And Jesus responds like this. He's like, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And without doing a massive theological dive that'll take us through a multitude of rabbit holes, basically what Jesus is saying is this, that it doesn't end. The amount of times that you forgive, it doesn't end. It's not 7 times. You know what? It's not 70 times. It's not 10 times. It's not 100 times. You just don't stop forgiving. You just don't stop loving them. You just don't stop allowing them a space to be reconciled back into relationship with you. You don't stop trying to outwork forgiveness. That never stops. It never stops. And so to help with this, because you can imagine that if it was me anyways, I've asked Jesus this question. And then he responds with 7. It's not 7 times, but it's 7 times 70. Like it's a lot. And you can see the kind of the confusion. Perhaps it's on Peter's mind. Like, I don't get that. Like, what do you mean? Like, surely there's an end result to it. And so Jesus, in order to try and explain what it is that he's getting at, starts sharing this story. Starts telling a story to Peter and the other disciples surrounding forgiveness, surrounding this idea. Because what Jesus is trying to get across to Peter is this: that forgiveness isn't about letting that person off the hook, it's about setting yourself free. And so to help with this, Jesus starts telling this parable or this story in order to try and convey what it is that he is saying here. And so Jesus says this: therefore, the kingdom of heaven can be compared to a king who decided to bring his accounts up to date with servants who had borrowed money from him. In the process, one of his debtors was brought in who owed him $1 million. Like, it's a big sum of money, huge sum of money that he owed. And he couldn't, slow down. He couldn't pay, so his master ordered that he be sold. Like, he has to get sold because he can't come up with the money. He's rang up several times, like, he's been on call waiting, I need an extension. Like, it's been those moments. But he can't pay. So the king orders that this guy be sold along with his wife, his children, and everything he owned in order to pay the debt that this guy owed. And there's a couple of things on the to start with when Jesus starts sharing and telling this story that the disciples are, that Peter is connecting with straight away, that sometimes I think that we overlook. Number one is this: that this is a story that Jesus is using to answer a direct question. Peter has asked a direct question about forgiveness, and Jesus is using this as a story to explain what kingdom forgiveness, godly forgiveness looks like. And there's some other things. The king in the story is God. The king in the story represents God. The servant in the story is Peter. Peter's the one asking the question. But it's anyone that's asking the question. It's anyone that struggles with hurt. It's anyone that ultimately wrestles with trying to forgive people. The king in the story is God. The servant is me. It is you. Jesus is specifically talking to Peter. The servant is Peter. And then the debt that what Jesus is trying to get at is your sin. Your sin. Sin simply is this: sin is missing God's standard. And God's standard isn't some arbitrary list of rules. It's his blueprint for the best possible way to live. As far as, like, sin is us, or in the Greek word would be like, it'd be missing the mark, would be the explanation of it. Missing the mark of God's standard of what he has and how he asks us and wants us to live. And when we do this, when we choose to follow our own way, it creates sin and destruction. When we choose to follow God's way, it brings life. And to quote a couple of passages, Romans puts it like this: it says that the wages of sin, the payment for sin, is death. It leads to death, it leads to destruction, it leads to chaos. And then Jesus, when he turns up on the scene, he says it like this in John 10:10. He says, I have come to give them a rich and satisfying life. And so with this idea, sin is this: it is missing God's standard. It is falling away from that ultimately whenever we pursue something other than God's standard, it leads us into sin, and that leads to death and destruction. When we follow Jesus in his way, it leads to a rich and satisfying life. Not necessarily wealth as far as monetary wealth, but a self-fulfillment of our heart. And in other words, what we're trying to extrapolate and get out is this idea that forgiveness isn't about letting them off the hook. It's about living in the fulfillment that Jesus has bought for us and wants us to live in when we follow him. And so the disciples and Peter, as Jesus is sharing this, he's instantly connecting these dots that, my gosh, Jesus is talking and connecting with me, and I'm this servant. And I'm this servant before God. And this servant is me, and here's the debt that I owe God because of my sin. But the man fell down. The story continues. The man fell down before his master and begged him, please be patient with me, and I will pay it all. I'll pay every penny. I'll pay it all back. Like, I'm gonna pay it. Please, don't sell me. Don't sell my wife. Don't sell my children. Don't sell my belongings. Don't sell my car. Don't sell anything. Like, I'm gonna pay it all back. And so the master listens to this, being the king. Then his master was filled with pity for him, and he released him and forgave his debt. The king is God. The servant is Peter, or you and I. The debt is sin, owing. The servant couldn't pay, but the king, being God, says, you know what? I'm going to forgive it. I'm going to forgive it. And you can imagine, because this would be me. If this was me asking Jesus this conversation face to face with Jesus, like it is with Peter, the sinking feeling that is happening in Peter's heart, he's just asked, like, when am I justifiably allowed to stop forgiving that individual of what it is that they've done? And then he starts telling this story of how much God has forgiven this individual servant, and Peter's realizing that this is Jesus talking about me. This is Jesus talking about you. And you can imagine, if it was me, my heart would start sinking due to the selfishness of my question. Like, when is it justifiable for me to just stop forgiving? And then he starts sharing the story and then connecting it with, he's talking about God forgiving me. And you can imagine that Jesus could have inserted a question like this. So if that's how God conducts business, how many times do you think is reasonable to forgive? If that's how, this is what Jesus is trying to get at with this story. If that's how God conducts business, Peter, how many times do you think is reasonable for you to forgive? And he would look at us, you and I, the exact same way when we wrestle with that or when we struggle with the idea of forgiving someone. He would look at us, and if he was to tell us that story, he'd be like, if that's how God conducts business, how many times do you think it's reasonable for you to forgive? Trying to get at this idea, it's not about letting them off the hook. It's not about letting them off the hook and saying what you did was okay. It's not all about that, but it's about setting your heart free. The story continues. But when the man left the king, he went to a fellow servant who owed him a few $1,000s. So this man has left the king after being forgiven for this incredible amount of money. He's left the king and he's gone elsewhere, and I'll paraphrase it the next little bit. And basically what he does is he leaves the king and he goes and he wants to start settling some of his own affairs. And so he starts calling people in, and one of the guys that he calls in, he owes him a debt. It's nowhere near as big as the debt that this guy owed the king, but he calls him in and he says, you need to pay up. You need to pay up. Like, I need this debt cleared. And the guy turns to him like, I cannot do it. Can I have an extension? Can you give me some more time? And he says, I cannot do that, and I will not do that. And there's this wrestling match as far as that goes on. Like, I can't do it, but you need to pay. There's no more extensions. And so what ends up happening is that this servant ends up taking that man and throws him in prison until his debts could be paid. And what he ends up doing is he throws him in prison and basically says it like this, that you're not coming out until your wife, your kids, your family, your friends can come up with enough money to bring it to me to buy your freedom. You're going to stay in here. The issue is that some of this guy's servants have been a part of both happenings. Some of this guy's servants were there when the king dragged him in, and they saw the generosity and the grace and the kindness of the king, and now they're watching this play out. And they're beside themselves. Like this just happened to him, and now he's doing this. And so then the story picks back up, because the servants that are watching this take place, they go to the king and they're like, King, you need to know what's happened. This guy that you showed incredible grace and mercy and kindness to, this is what he has just done. He has not shown that at all. He has not repeated this. And it says this, then the king called in the man that he had forgiven, and he said, you evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. And realize this, that this is Jesus trying to answer a question of how many times do I have to forgive until I don't need to forgive anymore. And this is Jesus getting to the heart of that if you are working like that, there's a problem. Where you're looking for an opportunity to stop forgiving, there is a problem. He says, shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? Then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. And you can imagine, if you're Peter, and if you're the disciples, this would have been like a pin drop moment. Everyone's gone so silent that you could hear a pin drop. Because this is the question that they've all been wrestling with. I don't like these people that I'm doing life with. They keep annoying me. They keep rejecting me. They keep doing dinners without me. They keep hurting me. And I want them in my life, but I don't want to get over this because I want them to feel the pain that they've inflicted upon me. Because maybe it's not you, but if I'm honest, when I don't want to forgive someone, if I ask enough questions, it's because I want them to feel the pain that they've inflicted on my heart. I want them to suffer. I want them to repay before I say I'll forgive you. And so Jesus is sharing this story. And you can imagine when it gets to this point, Jesus trying to connect all the dots. Your question ends with this. If this is what your heart looks like, it ends with this. If this is what your thought process looks like of when can I stop getting over it, it looks like this. And then Jesus says the final thing. This conversation's been running, the sinking feeling in their hearts has been going on, feeling smaller and smaller. They even asked this question. And then he says this. He says, that's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. Jesus is trying to connect to Peter. Jesus is trying to connect us to the reality and the importance of forgiving, of following suit in what he's done and actively forgiving. See, the problem that I think that we have, at least from the tradition that I came from, when we read stories like this, we read it from the perspective that this is all about the end of time after I've died and I've gone to heaven or I've gone to the judgment. And this is what's going to happen at the end if I don't forgive, that I'm going to end up in hell or in heaven. And as far as this story is all about that end moment where God comes and judges and sends one here and one there. This is all about that. But realize this is so important to realize, so important, that this is Jesus answering a literal question about someone's wrestle on how they do life today. This is Jesus answering that question of how to do life today. While this may have impact and be talking about the end of times of what perhaps is coming, this is Jesus answering a question on how life plays out today. And so the thought is this: while unforgiving might land you in hell tomorrow, it will certainly land you in a living hell today if you don't. It will land you in a living hell today if you don't. Because this is what unforgiveness does. It destroys your heart. It destroys every part of your life if you let it play its course out. It destroys families. It destroys relationships. It destroys marriages. It destroys workplaces. It destroys you, because what happens is a root of bitterness starts seeping in, and then it starts growing and multiplying and manifesting and becoming something bigger than it ever was at the start, because we don't start dealing with something. And it looks like this. We end up becoming the most easily offended person. Some of you will know that individual that you have to tiptoe around them on eggshells because depending on what you say depends on how they'll react to you for the next 6 months because they are an offended person. Why are they an offendable person? Because it's somewhere in their life there is something that they haven't forgotten, something they haven't forgiven. And what that does is it creates destruction, it creates a living hell. And so while it may land you in hell tomorrow, it's certainly going to land you in hell today. This is the reality, that if we play this out of not forgiving, of not loving, of not actively trying to follow Jesus' example and forgive people, this is what will play out today, not just eternity. Not just eternity. C.S. Lewis, great philosopher and an author and thinker of the last century, he says this in his book, The Great Divorce: the gates of hell are locked from the inside. Multiple ways that you can take that and interpret that and tease that out. But the gates of hell are locked from the inside. Meaning this, that when someone hurts you and you choose not to forgive and to develop bitterness, they're not locking you in prison. God's not locking you in prison. The action's not locking you in prison. You are locking you in prison by not forgiving. You are locking you in prison by not forgiving. Forgiveness isn't about letting them off the hook. It's about setting yourself free. Now, please understand, what I'm not trying to say and suggest that if you've had something absolutely atrocious done to you, if you're living in a harmful, hurtful, hateful, spiteful situation, that you just continue living in that, like, I'm not talking about those moments. Those moments, like, here's what I'd say: you still forgive. But you don't need to continue living in that space, right? You forgive, but you don't continue living in that space. What I'm trying to talk about and highlight is like, what do I do when someone gossips about me? What do I do when someone like stabs me in the back? What do I do when someone just says something nasty about me? When someone does something to me that causes this thing? And what do I do when someone spitefully does that versus what do I do at the same time when someone didn't deliberately do that? It was just the foolishness of their actions have caused this ripple effect and it's hurt me. What do I do? What do I do? That's what we're teasing out and that's what we're wrestling about. And the question is, like, how? How do I start? How do I start when I've driven past my friend's house and they're all gathering together and chose not to invite me? What do you do? What do you do when that co-worker just keeps stabbing you in the back? What do you do when your family member, like, whatever example you want to insert, what do you do? Like, where does it start? Where does it start? And I think it starts here. Remember what you've been forgiven of. Remember what you've been forgiven of. And this is exactly where Jesus starts this story. He starts this story talking with Peter. Peter's asking the question, how many times do I need to forgive? And he's like, okay, let me explain it by telling you this story. There was a king. There was a servant. There was a big debt. The king cleared this big debt. It starts from that spot. Remember what you've been forgiven of. And if you've been coming to church or if you've been engaged with Jesus for a long time, you've probably discovered this. You've probably had a revelation of this. You've probably had an engagement with this in your heart where you've realized how much it is that God has forgiven you. And that's a great start. It starts from that point, realizing and remembering how much I've been forgiven. But the other thing, you could take that a little bit deeper if you wanted. Maybe it's not deeper, maybe it's less deep, I don't know, but you can work that out. But you'd have friends and people in your life that have forgiven you for the things that you've done to them. And they chose to forgive you and keep you in relationship with them. Remember what you've been forgiven of. Because when the question comes up, well, when do I get to justifiably get over this? We can step back and remember this. How much have I been forgiven of? And if that's how God conducts business, what does that say about how I should conduct business? What does that say about us? And the thought is this. Jesus starts this parable talking about the kingdom. The kingdom of heaven is like, with this idea that every time that you choose to forgive, you're saying this: I'm choosing for God's way to win.
Amen.
I'm choosing for God's way to win in my life. I'm choosing for God's way to win in my relationships. I'm choosing for God's way to win in my marriage. I'm choosing for God's way to win in my workplace. I'm choosing for God's way to win, and I'm going to choose to follow his direction. So it starts with remembering what you've been forgiven of. The question is this: what if I forgave them the way God forgave me? What if I forgave that person the way God forgave me? And I don't know who that person is for you, but I know for some of you, there's a person on your heart that you're struggling with right now. Maybe they did something this week. Maybe it's been an ongoing struggle. Maybe it was something that was said today. There's a person on your heart that you're struggling with. So this is what I'd encourage you to do. I want you to picture them. Who's that individual that you're struggling to forgive? I want you to picture them. I want you to see their face. That person that's hurt you, that's cut you deep. I want you to picture them. And then this is the prayer that I want you to make. It's simple. It's going to be on the screen. It's so simple. I want you to do this. God, I release them to you.
Yeah.
I want you to picture them, and you can utter that prayer out loud. You can utter that prayer in your heart, but it simply starts with this: God, I release them to you. They've hurt me. They've hurt me an incredible amount. And I don't know how it is that I'm going to be able to get over this. But God, I release them to you. I don't want to carry this anymore. I don't want this hovering over me anymore. God, I'm going to release them to you. I'm going to release that action to you. I'm not going to carry it. It's not mine to carry. God, I'm going to release them to you. There's this story. Some of you, most of you probably know her, a survivor of the Nazi concentration camp, Corrie ten Boom. She was a Jewish survivor, and she gets out by the skin of her teeth, basically, and she witnessed the horrors, the atrocities of the concentration camp at the hands of the Nazis. And after getting out, she ends up traveling the world, writing books, sharing about the good news of Jesus, about what God did to her, how God protected her, how God loved her in the midst of all that atrocity, in the midst of all that horror. And so she starts sharing this and doing conferences and speaking engagements, sharing all that. And there was this one conference where after she's finished speaking, people are coming up and sharing and talking and thanking her and asking her to pray for her and pray for them and things like that. And there's this one guy that comes up and he reaches out his hand and he says, "Great message. Will you forgive me?" At that moment, she realized who he was. That he was one of the soldiers at the concentration camp. And you can imagine what would happen at that moment. The pain, the horror would have all come flooding back. She would have been able to feel every emotion that she felt while she was in that place. She'd be able to smell the smells again. Feel the gut-wrenching pain all over again. All of that would have come flooding back when this man walked up to her at that moment and said, "Great message, will you forgive me?" And what do you do? What do you do when someone that was responsible for inflicting some of the most atrocious things on humanity does in that moment? Corrie ten shares it, how the wrestling match bouncing around her heart of what do I do? What do I do in this moment? And then there's this overwhelming, she says, there's this overwhelming sense of I don't know what coming out of me. And it was this supernatural capacity to be able to say, I forgive you. I forgive you. And ultimately what she was doing is this: God, I release him to you. God, I release that person to you. This isn't mine to carry. This isn't mine to carry, because ultimately forgiveness isn't about letting them off the hook. It's about setting yourself free. And for that moment for Corrie, This wasn't about justifying his actions. It was about setting herself free. But I'm not going to continue to carry this hurt. It's not mine to carry. The question I'd ask you is, what hurt is holding your heart? Who is holding your heart? Who is it that you need to forgive? And that starts simply with the question of, God, I release them to you. Let me pray. God, forgiveness is such a complex and difficult thing. This is dealing with the innermost pains and emotions of our heart. And gosh, it's hard. God, I know it's hard when people have hurt me. I know it's hard for me to let go and to make it a deliberate choice to just hand them over to you. It doesn't justify their actions, but releases their actions from having a stronghold over me. So God, I realize this, that for some of us here in this room, maybe even some of us watching online, that this is an incredibly raw thought. This is an incredibly raw message because the pain done to us is so deep, so deep. And I'm convinced of this, Father, that there's some things that they are impossible to forgive, Jesus, without you. They're impossible to forgive without you. But I want to say thank you, God, for the stories like from Corrie, Jesus, that with you all things are possible, God. Yeah. With you everything is possible. Yeah. So Jesus, I want to pray over, first and foremost, for the people that this is incredibly raw. This is incredibly tough, and this is incredibly challenging. God, I want to pray that you help them to release something supernatural, Father, from their heart, God. Something supernatural that they are able to release them over to you, Father. Not to justify their actions, but so that action, that person, that whatever it was that was done doesn't carry that individual person's heart anymore, Father. That they are released from it, Father. So God, I want to pray that as they're saying that prayer, God, I release them over to you, Father. Do something supernatural in their heart and to release that, Jesus. I want to pray for all of us, God, because all of us at different times and moments, we struggle with this, God. We struggle with people hurting us, no matter how deep and profound or how small, God, we all struggle with it, Jesus. But God, I want to pray that we are people that are deliberate at following your leading, Jesus, and following your example and choosing to forgive because we realize how much it is that we've been forgiven. How much it is that you've forgiven us, how much it is that you've counseled from us, God. So God, let us be people that follow that example. And Jesus, I want to say thank you that when we do that, we make space for marriages to be restored. We make space for our marriages to be restored, for our relationships to be restored, for our friendships to be restored, for our workplaces to be restored. And so God, I want to pray that as we as a community of believers actively try our hardest, God, to outwork that we see restoration coming into our lives. We see restoration coming into every area where darkness has invaded, Father. But as we start forgiving, Jesus, it enables your Spirit to go in, to move in, Father, and to bring freedom, Jesus. And God, I want to pray that freedom starts in our hearts, God. So I want to say thank you that forgiveness isn't about letting them off the hook, God, but it's about us living in the freedom that you want us to live in Jesus' name. And everyone said, amen. Hey, if you want to chat about that, because I know that's heavy for some of you, love to chat, love to pray. But otherwise, head out, grab a tea or a coffee. Up the back on the right-hand side, there is a table, and some of our greeters will be there. If this is your first time, my encouragement would be head up there. We have a gift box for you. It's got some goodies in it. And ultimately, we just want to say thank you very much for being here. So head out, grab a tea or coffee. And I won't see you next week because Sage and I are in Encounter Church ministering, but you will enjoy the ice cream.